The sharp, blade-like voice of the renowned conductor Richard Wellington echoed through the empty concert hall, slicing through an already stifling atmosphere. "Get that black man off the stage. He's blind. He's going to ruin the Bosendorf." A single spotlight bathed the figure standing tall and proud at the center of the hall. It was Thomas Miller, 68, a blind African-American and Vietnam War veteran. He gripped a white cane tightly in one hand, while the fingers of the other trembled as they brushed against the polished surface of the grand piano. No one present, sound engineers, musicians, or staff, could hide their shock. A few awkward chuckles rippled through the space, but Thomas remained still. His posture was straight and calm, like a monument, a reflection of the military discipline etched into his being through years of brutal warfare. The deep scars across his face were unerasable evidence of that war, but perhaps more than his vision, he had lost something far greater: his closest comrades, his unfinished dreams, and the man he once was. All that remained was a new self, wounded yet unbreakable, standing now in front of the cold and merciless judgment of a glittering world. Wellington walked slowly, adjusting the cuff of his designer shirt with icy composure, making no effort to mask his contempt. "I don't know who allowed you in here, but it was clearly a serious mistake. This is a Bosendorfer worth nearly $300,000. 0 cents, not meant for amateurs." Thomas said nothing. He didn't retreat. He simply turned gently toward Wellington's voice, his cloudy eyes seeming to look through both space and time, into a world where music was the only light to guide him. He sat at the piano bench with an uncanny calm. Under the tense gaze of music festival director James Harrington, the room fell into total silence. Harrington knew he couldn't afford to risk his powerful ties with Wellington, who brought not only prestige, but also crucial sponsorships. Yet even he couldn't understand how Thomas had made it through the most competitive selection process in the festival's history, where over 1,200 gifted musicians had applied, and only 14 were chosen. Not one of them was a blind old man with no formal music education. Wellington muttered bitterly to his assistant, "This is absurd. Who does he think he is, Bach reincarnated?" It was then that Thomas finally spoke, his voice low, composed, tinged with the rhythm of the American South. "Mr. Wellington, with all due respect, I'm here because I was invited. The least you can do is give me a chance to prove it." Wellington crossed his arms, his gaze as cold as steel. "You've got 2 minutes, not a second more." Since the day Clara, his wife, soulmate and savior, passed away 8 months earlier, the silence inside Thomas's small apartment had become suffocating. The emptiness wasn't just auditory, it echoed through every corner of his soul. It wasn't mere loneliness, it was the absence of a part of his spirit, the only person who had ever seen light in him when the world saw only darkness. To survive the pain, Thomas had for the first time in his life stepped out of his own shadow and brought his music to public spaces. A small street-side cafe, local veterans meetings, charity events for those who had nothing left but memories. He didn't play for recognition, he played as if whispering to Clara, as if each note was his way of telling their story to the woman who could no longer hear it. At one of those small performances, a young woman named Sarah Lindsay, a PhD student in musicology, happened to hear his playing, and it stopped her cold. It wasn't like anything she'd ever heard in a classroom. No technical bravado, no showmanship, just raw, honest purity. Sarah secretly recorded the performance and through tireless effort and connections with the festival organizers, managed to get Thomas onto the program of one of the most prestigious music festivals in America. Without him even knowing, now, seated before the mighty Bosendorfer, Thomas placed his slender fingers on the keys. Hands that once held a rifle in the jungles now trembled, not from fear, but from anticipation. He didn't ask what piece to play, didn't need braille sheets or guidance. He carried only one composition, him. The room was suffocatingly silent. Wellington checked his watch, annoyed. Then, the first notes sounded. It wasn't just music. It was a living journey, a prelude that whispered like the mist in the deep Vietnamese forest, where jungle birds called out, where leaves stirred in invisible wind, where young soldiers held their breath, hearts pounding in the deadly quiet. Wellington's arm slowly dropped, his expression of scorn fading into confusion. Elements played as if time no longer existed. Each note was a scar, a memory peeled open and transformed into sound. There was a raw, unfiltered authenticity in every movement, something no conservatory could teach. And gradually, everyone in the room, technicians, musicians, even those who had mocked him, realized a chilling truth. They had almost missed something extraordinary because of their prejudice. Backstage, Sarah smiled quietly. She knew what no one else there did. Thomas Miller wasn't just a self-taught pianist. He carried within him a secret, a strength capable of turning a moment of public humiliation into a redemptive performance that the world would never forget. The final notes hung in the air of the now breathless hall. 2 minutes had passed, yet no one dared interrupt. Finally, Wellington spoke, his voice no longer sure of itself. "That's enough. Your time is up." He tried to keep a cold expression. "Thank you for the performance, but it changes nothing. This festival has its own standards." Thomas stood, gripping his white cane, and bowed quietly. "Thank you for the opportunity, sir." Waiting for him in the wings was Sarah, short-haired and sharp-eyed, a voice of a new generation. At 27, she represented the young people constantly challenging the narrow standards of the classical music world. And today, she had just planted the seed of a revolution born from the heart. "You were extraordinary," Sarah whispered as she gently guided Thomas out of the hall. Her eyes lingered on Wellington's confused expression. He really panicked. "I've never seen that look in his eyes before." Thomas simply shook his head, his voice steady and low. It doesn't matter, Sarah. I'm not here to impress people like him." On the way back to the hotel, Sarah drove in silence while Thomas sat still in the passenger seat, his wrinkled hands resting lightly on his white cane. The years, the memories of war, they all weighed heavily on him, not from pain, but from the sheer gravity of what he had overcome to arrive at this moment. After a while, Sarah broke the silence, curiosity and emotion in her voice. "How can you play like that? It's nothing like anything I've ever heard." Thomas turned his face toward the window, where the fading afternoon light cast a soft glow on his weathered features. "You know the phrase, seeing in the dark? For me, it's not a metaphor." 2 days later, Sarah knocked on the door of Thomas's temporary apartment, a thick stack of documents and a laptop in her arms. "Good news and bad," she said as she stepped inside. "Wellington convinced the organizers to remove you from the official performance lineup. But I've got something better." Thomas's voice echoed from the tiny kitchen. "Don't worry about me, Sarah. I've lived long enough to know that every closed door isn't an end, just the beginning of another path." "It's not worry," Sarah replied, her voice trembling with emotion. "This is justice, and maybe a little bit of payback." A plan was set in motion. Sarah had persuaded the historic St. Matthew's Church, just 2 blocks from the main concert hall, to host a performance at the exact same time Wellington was scheduled to play. "I know it sounds crazy," she admitted, "but I have a friend in cultural media. We'll live stream the whole thing." Thomas smiled as he poured tea without spilling a drop. "You're clever and stubborn, just like Clara." Sarah went still. Thomas rarely spoke of Clara. Seeing an opening, she asked softly, "You never told me, how did you two meet?" Thomas touched a deep scar that ran from his temple down to his right cheek, a souvenir from the battlefield. "She taught me how to see the world again, in a way no one could ever imagine." In the weeks that followed, Wellington began publicly criticizing Thomas. On a popular podcast, he mocked him as a charity case trying to pass for an artist. When a reporter asked about the blind veteran's performance, he scoffed, "Maybe we should add a special category for inspirational people right next to the kids' recitals." But what Wellington didn't anticipate was that each insult only fueled Thomas's fire and ignited growing public interest. The night before the performance, inside the quiet sanctuary of St. Matthew's Church, Thomas and Sarah rehearsed one final time. His fingers glided over the old keys, producing a sound that made the aging wooden rafters seem to hum along in rhythm. From the front pew, Sarah looked up and asked, "Are you sure you want to play this piece? It's nothing like what people expect. They're coming for Chopin, Beethoven." Thomas paused, his fingers suspended in midair. He didn't turn around. His voice came slow and deep, like a prayer. "Whenever you lose the light on the battlefield, Sarah, you understand. There are two kinds of darkness, one that traps you and one that frees you from everything. My music comes from the second kind, the kind that sets you free," Thomas said. Elsewhere, in his luxurious apartment, Wellington flipped through sheet music, his brow furrowed. The thunderous applause for Thomas a few nights earlier still echoed somewhere in his mind, creating a distraction more irritating than he wanted to admit. A young assistant entered hesitantly, holding a tablet. "Sir, you might want to see this." Wellington took it, his eyes scanning the headline. "Musical Showdown, Forgotten Genius, Worse Fading Master. 2 performances, 1 defining moment." He scoffed and tossed the tablet onto the table. "Ridiculous. Who's going to choose some amateur in a dusty old church over me in the city's finest concert hall?" The assistant hesitated, then murmured, "His show's online ticket reservations have already exceeded the church's full capacity, sir." On the morning of the performance, Thomas woke before the sun. He opened an old suitcase he'd brought from Nashville, one that held the most precious possession of his life. Inside was a time-worn wooden box, which concealed a secret he had carried for nearly half a century. Sarah walked in and found him already dressed, one hand resting gently on the box. "What's that?" she asked. "Something I've kept safe for the last 50 years, Thomas replied, his cloudy eyes reflecting a quiet contemplation. "And today, it's time to reveal it." 2 hours before showtime, St. Matthew's Church was packed to capacity. Reporters and bloggers jostled in the back while student volunteers rushed to finish setting up cameras for the live stream. In a makeshift dressing room behind the sanctuary, Sarah noticed a quiet tension in Thomas's eyes. Not fear of the stage, but something deeper. "You need to know this," he said, opening the box. Inside was a faded newspaper clipping from 1964, the yellowed paper crackling with age. The headline read, "Musical prodigy leaves Juilliard to enlist. My country needs me more than music. Thomas Miller." Sarah held the paper in trembling hands. "Oh my God, you studied at Juilliard?" Thomas gave a slight nod, a wistful smile forming on his lips. 3 years, under the very man who now believes I'm unworthy of even touching his Bosendorf. The truth hit Sarah like a bolt of lightning. "Wellington, he was your professor?" Thomas gently pulled out an old photograph from the box. A young man in uniform, shaking hands with a much younger Richard Wellington. "And never really saw me," Thomas murmured. "And tonight isn't about revenge. It's about redemption. For me and for him." At exactly 7:30 p.m., the church doors opened, and the stark contrast between 2 musical worlds became more vivid than ever. At the opulent Symphony Hall, Wellington stepped onto the stage in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, receiving scattered applause from a thin crowd. At that very moment, in the modest sanctuary of St. Matthew's, the audience was shoulder to shoulder. Dozens of cameras were in place to record what would become a performance unlike any other. Wellington raised his chin and adjusted his bow tie. His voice rang out, icy and deliberate. "Tonight I will perform Rachmaninoff with the dignity and technical precision that classical music deserves." A statement aimed like an arrow at the blind veteran, the man bold enough to emerge from darkness and tell his story through sound. Sarah gently led Thomas to the humble Yamaha piano at the center of St. Matthew's. His white cane tapped against the cold stone floor, marking each step like a sacred imprint in time. This wasn't the grand Bosendorfer of the Symphony Hall. This was an old piano, donated years ago, restored with love and respect for music. Sarah glanced around. The pews were packed. Among the crowd were harsh critics, music bloggers, and conservatory professors. Her heart pounded. There are a lot of important people here. Thomas simply smiled. I didn't come here for them. No grand introduction was needed. Sarah stepped up and spoke briefly, her voice tight with emotion. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight you'll hear a kind of music no conservatory could ever teach. The room fell instantly silent. Thomas sat down. No sheet music, no spotlight. Just a blind man and a piano. His fingers hovered over the keys like they were searching for memories. And then, sound. It wasn't just music, it was a confession, a living history, an original composition that opened with solemn, disciplined notes, echoing the academic rigor of Juilliard in the 1960s, a signature anyone fluent in classical music would instantly recognize. In the audience, an older critic squinted and whispered, "Sounds like young Richard Wellington." Meanwhile, at Symphony Hall, mid-performance, Wellington's assistant leaned in to whisper, "Sir, something's happening. The veteran's performance is going viral, and there's an old photo circulating." "Order photo?" Wellington snapped in a low growl. "It's you and a young soldier. They're saying he was your student at Juilliard before he enlisted." Wellington froze. Themselves. "That can't be." On the tablet, a photo from Thomas's wooden box appeared. A young man in uniform shaking hands with a younger Wellington. Long before either of them had been tested by the storms of life. Wellington's spine tingled. Tommy Miller, dear God. Back at the church, Thomas launched into a complex, breathtaking section, flawlessly blending classical precision with the raw emotional depth that only someone who'd lost everything could truly channel. The church was entranced. Every gaze, every breath, every heartbeat followed his every motion. Backstage, Sarah could no longer hold back her tears. Thomas paused for a moment, then spoke, his voice cutting through the silence, each word resonating deeply. "This part is dedicated to my teacher, Richard Wellington. He once taught me that technical perfection is the highest ideal of music. But life has taught me emotional truth is what makes music eternal." Online, the live stream viewership had just passed 50,000. Meanwhile, Symphony Hall was quietly emptying, while St. Matthew's had no space left to stand. A reporter from New York Classical Review was already typing furiously. While Wellington continues to recycle technically flawless yet soulless performances, his forgotten student just redefined the essence of contemporary music. At Symphony Hall, Wellington faltered. The memories came flooding back like a tidal wave. The brilliant young student who had walked away from Juilliard to serve his country. The harsh words he once uttered. "You're throwing away your talent for some naive idea of patriotism." And now, that very student, the one he had judged and forgotten, was redefining art, not through fame or awards, but through the truth of his soul. Back then, it was just a small column tucked in the corner of a newspaper. Juilliard student Tommy Miller injured in combat in Vietnam. Wellington had read it and folded it away like so many other trivial things. New students arrived, his career progressed. Awards came steadily. The name Tommy Miller gradually disappeared, reduced to a faint footnote in his long professional journey, until tonight. At St. Matthew's Church, Thomas brought his piece to a close with a deeply personal, narrative final movement. Through sound, he told the story of his life, youthful brilliance, war and loss, decades of silence, and now rebirth. It was no longer music in the traditional sense. It was a new kind of testimony, a living, breathing record of an extraordinary life. As the final note echoed, the church fell into a hypnotic stillness. Then, one by one, the audience stood. Applause erupted like a tidal wave, thunderous, endless. Cries of "Bravo!" bounced off the ancient stone walls, as if awakening the very spirit of the church. Meanwhile, back at Symphony Hall, Wellington looked out at a house now barely 1/3 full. His phone buzzed relentlessly in his coat pocket with notification after notification. In the middle of his playing, he missed a note, then another. His composure unraveled. A message from the festival board flashed on his screen. Immediate explanation required regarding Thomas Miller. At the church, as the applause subsided, Thomas stood and his voice echoed through the sacred space. I didn't come here for revenge or to shame anyone. I came to share what I learned when the light left me. True music doesn't need to be seen. It only needs to be felt. Sarah stepped up, grinning, her eyes shining. You know what? Social media is exploding right now, she continued teasingly. What would you like to say to the record labels and producers? Thomas smiled serenely, placing a hand on the old wooden box. Tell them I didn't play today for a contract or recognition. I played for Clara, the one who taught me how to see the world with my heart. And yes, I played for Richard Wellington too, to show him that real beauty doesn't lie in perfection, but in emotional truth. The greatest triumph wasn't humiliating his former teacher. It was transforming pain into something that rose above everything else. A symphony of forgiveness and transcendence. The circle had closed, not through destruction, but through creation. As Thomas was guided off the stage, he left behind something more powerful than resentment, a question that resonated even with the most hardened hearts. How many extraordinary talents still live in darkness simply because the world chooses to listen with its eyes instead of its heart? By the next morning, Thomas's performance had gone viral. In under 12 hours, the video had surpassed 2 million views. Critics from the New York Times and The Guardian published glowing reviews, calling his performance a redefinition of true virtuosity, where human resilience is transformed into sound. Wellington, in contrast, faced a firestorm of criticism. The festival board convened an emergency meeting and, in an unprecedented decision, removed him from the performance roster for the next 3 years. His record label issued a statement saying it would reevaluate their partnership. 3 universities rescinded their teaching invitation. It's wild how fast everything flipped, Sarah said, showing Thomas the headlines on her tablet. They're calling you the forgotten conscience of classical music. Thomas smiled gently, his hands resting on the wooden box he'd carried his whole life. I don't want Wellington to be ruined, Sarah. I just want him to truly listen. The phone kept ringing, but now those sounds were no longer noise. They were wake-up calls, not just for a teacher, but for an entire world that had forgotten how to feel with its heart. The overwhelming acclaim following the St. Matthew's performance brought Thomas things he never imagined. Prestigious label Deutsche Grammophon offered him an exclusive contract. Lincoln Center invited him to headline a special concert series. And in a deeply symbolic gesture, Juilliard, where he had once turned away to go to war, announced the creation of the Thomas Miller Scholarship, supporting veterans pursuing music. Elsewhere, in his sleek, glass-walled apartment, Wellington sat in silence, watching Thomas's CNN interview for the 3rd time. The veteran spoke without bitterness, recounting his musical journey as a kind of salvation after tragedy. When I lost the light, I learned a new way to listen, Thomas said, not just with my ears, but with my whole being, with memory, with pain transformed into sound. Wellington turned off the TV. He walked toward his familiar Steinway and sat down, but as he placed his hands on the keys, something strange happened. For the first time in 40 years, the piano felt silent, not because it made no sound, but because his heart no longer knew what it needed to play. 3 months later, in Nashville, Thomas officially opened a unique music school, one where all barriers dissolved in the face of empathy. Founded by him, the school welcomed people with disabilities, veterans with PTSD, blind children, anyone for whom music could become the universal language that transcends physical limits. Sarah, now both assistant and executive director of the school's charitable foundation, managed day-to-day operations and had already helped dozens of students find peace through music. One late autumn afternoon, she led Thomas into the school's lobby, where a soft breeze swept through the open window. "There's something I want to show you," she said. "What is it?" Thomas asked, feeling the cool, fresh air. "A letter from Richard Wellington." Thomas nodded gently. "Read it to me." It was a short letter, handwritten in familiar script, on personal stationery. "Thomas, I've spent decades teaching technical perfection, but it was you who made me realize the most important thing I'd forgotten, the soul of music. I'm learning to listen again. If you'll allow it, I'd like to visit your school. Not to teach, but to learn from you." Wellington, Thomas smiled, his heart briefly stirred by the memory of the once ambitious young professor. "Hey, tell him he's always welcome. Music is generous. It always leaves the door open for second chances." 2 weeks later, Wellington appeared at the school gates. The expensive suits and trademark arrogance were gone. In their place, a simple outfit and a look of humility, almost unfamiliar, even to himself. In the school's small recital hall, he sat quietly in the front row, watching as Thomas taught a group of blind children. Thomas didn't teach theory or technique alone. He taught them how to feel each vibration, to discover beauty within imperfection, and to turn their limits into their own unique voice. As night fell, Thomas sat at the piano, not to perform, but to heal. His melody spoke of loss, war, and darkness, but also of rebirth, compassion, and forgiveness. At the end of the session, Wellington approached him, tears quietly falling. "You could have destroyed me," Thomas responded softly. "Revenge would have made me blind all over again. I chose to turn pain into something better." Thomas Miller did not win by humiliation or belated fame. His true victory was in redefining what light meant in the world of music, where it's not the eyes but the heart that truly sees. While one man spent a lifetime chasing flawless technique and lost his connection to emotion, the other found his true self in the deepest layers of darkness, where pain, memory, and love converged into a sound that could never be replicated. Two men, teacher and student, once divided by war, now reunited by music. They had become living symbols of a timeless truth. True talent is not in what the eyes can see, but in what the heart can feel. If this story touched you, remember, greatness doesn't always begin where the world expects it to. Sometimes it sprouts from what is overlooked, from those who were once forgotten. And the most beautiful form of revenge is not to destroy those who hurt you, but to rise beyond every limit they ever placed on you and create something so beautiful, even your harshest critics cannot help but bow before the undeniable truth of your talent and your soul. If you believe that greatness doesn't come from the spotlight, but from quiet choices made in the dark, if you believe that music can heal, forgive, and offer second chances, leave a comment to share what moved you most about this story. Don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss a story that touches the soul. And share this video with someone who needs a little light, because maybe they too are learning how to listen in the dark.